the Harvard Business School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the first of 2 special editions on the state of American competitiveness. Harvard's leading professors have taken a close look at American enterprise, and their prescriptions could dramatically change the face of U.S. business. In the next half hour, we'll hear from Professor Bruce Scott, a specialist on national economic policy. Alfred Chandler, a business historian who thinks today's companies are paying the price for unwise decisions made in the 1960s. Michael Yoshino, a leading expert on doing business with Japan. And Michael Porter, a top corporate strategist with new ideas about comparative advantage. What they're teaching at the Harvard Business School, lessons on how U.S. corporations can compete in the world market. From Cambridge, Massachusetts, this is American Interests. American Interests is made possible by IBM and Pfizer, Inc. and these leading foundations.
Welcome to American Interests. I'm Morton Kondracki. International competitiveness has emerged as a key issue on America's national agenda. Many feel that American business is in decline, no longer able to compete on the international scene. This issue is of importance to all of us because it concerns jobs, savings, and the quality of life in America. Here at the Harvard Business School, people are working on a comeback strategy for America. For the next half hour, we'll talk to people who are training young Americans to compete in tomorrow's global economy.
Now that everyone begins business or a profession so late in life, it is almost necessary to shorten the time before one becomes valuable. That observation certainly applies to America's current crop of MBAs, but it was made back in 1907 by Lawrence Lowell, a professor seeking support for a new experiment in education called the Harvard Business School. For 80 years, the Harvard Business School has played a central role in shaping how commerce is conducted in America. Now, far from the idyllic banks of the Charles River, foreign companies are challenging America's economic strength, raising fundamental questions about the relationship between owner and operator, management and labor, government and business. Bruce Scott is a professor of business administration and a student of national economic strategies. According to Professor Scott, in the game of international business, the rules have changed.
Professor Scott, what is the problem with American competitiveness? Why are we seemingly falling behind our major trading partners?
I think you'll see it if you look in the factory and you say, are we running a factory competitively with the Japanese? I think the answer is no, and I can ask why. Second, you can say, have U.S. corporate strategies adjusted to the kind of competition that they have from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, to a lesser degree Germany, Switzerland? I think, again, the answer is no.
What does that mean? What do you mean by that?
If you say, how did we respond when the new competition really begins to hit in the 1960s as the Japanese join the game and the Europeans come back, part of it has been a flight of fancy, saying I want to maintain the profitability and the growth rates that we had in an earlier era, and there was no real way to do that. And people have done it by playing a numbers game in Wall Street of trying to buy earnings per share through mergers and acquisitions. And it's been, I think, a very destructive process.
What does government do about trade policy?
Well, I guess I would say number one has got to recognize that simply individual firms competing with individual firms is what we would prefer, but that's not what we've got. And we're going to have to adjust to the fact that other people think that seeing a whole industry like a food chain is constructive, that trying to influence the risks and rewards for that whole food chain is constructive, and that there's an active role for government. And we're playing against countries that are doing it, they're doing it successfully, and they're not going to give it up. I think that's what we have to do to adjust.
So the law of comparative advantage no longer applies?
Well, it's a law of comparative advantage where natural resources are irrelevant, and the comparative advantages are, in a sense, built by people through companies in a system that's controlled by a country.
What does this do to the international trading system as we know it? I mean, if we say to the Japanese that they're indulging in unfair trade practices, how can we say that to somebody else if there aren't rules that apply to everyone?
You're using it in the fair unfair. Let's go to football, all right, and say, hey, the problem is the other guy cheats. Are we going to start cheating ourselves and then say to the third party, hey fellas, why don't you play fair? Let me switch the analogy. Suppose you've always been playing single wing football and somebody comes on the field and starts playing T-formation football. You either say to yourself, gee, I'm going to say the guy's a cheat. He's not going to give it up. He recognizes he's got a more effective way to organize 11 people than you have. What's happened in football is everybody's developed T-formation football. You have rules. You have rules how many times you can bump an end going down the field. And I think we have to recognize that what Japan, Korea, to a degree, France and Germany some of the time do, is simply a more effective way to play football than we do. And they aren't going to change. Now, and they don't consider it to be cheating.
What do you think about the idea of industrial strategies? That is to say that the government offers tax benefits, tries to pick winners and losers in industries, tries to somehow organize the specific sectors of the American economy to compete abroad?
Well, you got some use of words in there. All right. First of all, if you said, is it going to make sense to allow more organization by industry, more collective activity by industry, and government encouragement of some of those? I think the answer is yes. As hard as that's going to sit in this country, it's already happening, and the obvious example is electronics. The defense appropriation for this year includes a $100 million public subsidy to Semitech to help nourish a whole food chain in electronics. That's one, and I think that's really going to be the test case of industrial policy. It's not picking winners and losers. Look, that says, can you go to the Kentucky Derby and pick winners and losers? Well, I think the answer is no. Even if you have a Japanese advisor, you're not going to pick the winner with any consistency. Can you tell the difference between a Kentucky Derby and a county fair? Can you tell the difference between a racehorse and a plow horse? Right? Somebody that can really run. Can you tell a high-growth area from a low-growth area? I think the answer is yes. Now, we've got a bunch of other countries that think they know how to do that. They're doing it. In the case of the electronics industry, I think that's really why Congress voted the money. They didn't vote it because the administration asked them to it. They voted out of a gut recognition that electronics and semiconductors are vital to the future of the country. And without any clear intellectual rationale, and certainly with no help from the academic community on that rationale, they're saying, we're going to vote a public subsidy, which is about 50% of the cost of that effort.
The common understanding of the way the Japanese operate is that they have the government, banks, and corporations operating in tandem in order to find markets in the United States and organize themselves. Now, is that what you're recommending for the United States?
No, but it's closer to it than what you think. First of all, again, I would change your description of it. If you say working in tandem, all right, working in tandem to shift the risks and rewards in Japan. If you identify something that's really high priority for the community as a whole, the next step up with the computer, the flat screen for the television, the integrated digital network, Japan and France has done the same thing by saying we're going to enrich the telephone service, we're going to make everybody pay for it, our suppliers are going to be able to deal with that before other people, we're all going to have an advantage. It's saying thinking collectively about an industry, business, government, the banks in their case, yeah, it's simply when it's done and done right, it's going to beat us. Time and again, it's going to beat us.
Now, what do you want your students to do when they graduate from here? What do you want the Harvard Business School to be teaching them that it's maybe not teaching them now, and what do you want them to do differently than the students of, say, 5 years ago?
Number one would be to see more of them going back to work in the real economy. And
which is to say?
Well, less of them on Wall Street. And the stock market crash and the huge cutbacks that are now coming is going to drive down compensation in that area to where it's closer to what it is.
And they are going to go into manufacturing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, as I say, there's a dramatic shift in enrollments here that's already taken place in this second term. And as people see last year's graduates getting laid off, is I wish we were teaching people more that what we would call business history. We're too much focused on short-term action movie. It's as though you're going to ride and cut them off at the pass 3 times a day. Well, that's not the pace at which the business world works, and it's certainly not the pace at which the big decisions develop. There aren't 3 a day, there aren't 3 a month. And for a lot of people, there aren't 3 in a year.
Business history and an appreciation for the real pace of corporate life are the provinces of Alfred Chandler, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who joined Harvard's faculty in 1970. He argues that the problems facing corporate managers today are the legacy of decisions made in the 1960s.
Professor Chandler,
this cat has caught up and is beginning to compete very effectively. In that sense, it's a relative decline. Remember that the whole modern world begins at just before World War I, 1880s and 90s. World War I comes, Europe just recovers, World War II comes, Europe just recovers, and the 50s and 60s, they've come back. And then there's a whole new world, really new, and that's Japan, that just wasn't an industrial competitor. It was just coming out of the Middle Ages, its feudal ages, before World War I. And from 1931 on was a military nation that wasn't concerned with commercial things. And they come back, there's been a tremendous transfer of technology after the war, and they've done it well, and they're beginning to compete.
how much of the decline is owing to changes in the way the American corporation operates?
Let's put it this way. Firms grew in two ways, and it have since the 1880s. You grow by expanding overseas in the foreign markets, or you move into related markets.
What you're saying is that this is the right way to do it.
Exactly, yeah.
But something happened to American corporations.
You're right.
And when did it happen, and why did it happen?
It happened in the merger movement of the 60s. It's the great turning point. It happened because so many firms were getting competition from abroad and from other industries that they, in many cases, said, why should we put our money back into this industry where market share is getting tough? We're getting a lot of competition, excess capacity. Let's find a new, dynamic industry. Mm-hmm. And so they began, and this happened in many, many companies, they began looking around for other industries. Well, we're sort of in communications. Let's find another communication industry. They didn't do what their predecessors did and say, we now have certain advantages. If we go in this field, we're going to be able to take market share. They didn't ask those questions.
Mm-hmm. The example is what?
Well, the two frames of this, but you can take a lot of examples. RCA, when it should have been putting money back into videotapes, starts to buy a wide range of things that hardly have anything to do with when the second Saranov comes in. GE moves off into mining, a big mining company. Even Exxon into business machines. Mm-hmm. A lot of people thought the computer was going to be, everybody should get into that. And without thinking about the nature of the competitive advantage.
Why didn't they, why couldn't one say that what they were doing is simply diversifying? In other words,
but they were diversifying in a way that wasn't going to pay off. Yeah. And they had forgotten their heritage. Uh-huh. And I will give Harvard Business School some credit for this. When I came here in the 1970s, they were teaching, in fact, that if you can run one thing, you can run anything. The thought was management was a specialized skill, and what I call the economies of scope, management was most important. And that was one of the rationales for the merger movement of the 60s. We'll put a lot of these firms together, and we have management that they don't have. Mm-hmm. And we'll be able to make them better, and we might even buy them and sell them off. And we can get companies cheap now, we'll build them up, sell them off, and this was a whole new world, buying and selling companies. Mm-hmm.
Perhaps no problem is more vexing for American business than the challenge posed by the Japanese. The emergence of a new phase in U.S.-Japanese corporate relations, marked by what he calls strategic alliance.
Professor Yoshino, the United States, most people in the United States think of our relationship to Japan as being strategic alliance on the geopolitical level, but intense rivalry on the industrial level, on the economic competitive level. Is that the proper way for Americans to look at Japan?
I don't think so. I think there's obviously a strong competitive element between Japan and the United States in the industrial scene, and we see it every day in the marketplace in this country. And however, in the last several years, I think we have seen a number of American companies, as a means to increase their competitiveness, have entered a partnership with the Japanese companies. And I think there has been to many companies, to some companies anyway, I think this approach has proved to be a pretty effective competitive weapon.
Mm-hmm. And do you recommend it across the board? I mean, is this the answer to America's competitive problem?
No, I don't think this is the answer. I don't think this is the prescription, but I think there is a way that American companies can take advantage of the resources, the energy and the competence of the Japanese workers and engineers and other resources that Japanese companies
ultimately to limited international competition between countries and sort of a global economy where the competitors are basically multinational corporations?
Yes, I think we're seeing a trend towards that, and to a certain degree. And for example, when we have 30-some odd car companies, major car companies throughout the world, and I would suspect it's interesting, if you just look at the auto industry, there are really a tremendous number of these strategic alliances and relationships. And one can predict that by 1995 or year 2000, there'll be about several different groups will be competing rather than 35 different companies.
If a company becomes convinced that it ought to establish joint ventures, licensing agreements with Japanese corporations as a means of expanding and surviving, does the carrying out of that strategy not put emphasis within the corporate structure on the deal maker, the international expert, as opposed to the operations manager, the manufacturer? I mean, aren't we back to our old problem again, that it's not the guys who are making the goods who are dominating the corporation, but rather somebody who's looking for some other opportunity?
I'm certainly pleased that you asked that question, because I think there's a fundamental difference between acquisition mentality that my esteemed colleague Al Chandra talked about and what I'm talking about. I think I am indeed very concerned about the deal-making mentality of American companies. But the kinds of strategic alliances I'm talking about, I think, encourages Americans and give American companies opportunities to learn from the Japanese and for the Japanese to learn from Americans. Let me give you an example, if I may. When companies get into these kinds of relationships, what I recommend is that they should never give up manufacturing or design or R&D. They could give up part of it, but they should not give up all of it. And also, by working together with Japanese, that certainly I think I've seen company after company where the relationship has to be managed. And managing that relationship is extremely difficult. And it's not simply giving up a function. And it's not simply giving up, not doing a manufacturing. If American companies view it that way, I think that would be a kiss of death. And but I think number of American companies that I'm looking at now, I think is sophisticated enough that we're going to have this relationship with the Japanese, and this will give us an opportunity to learn from the Japanese or work with the Japanese, and we're going to maintain a substantial design, manufacturing, and marketing base here, and we would only let the Japanese do certain things. But I think indeed, there is a fundamental difference between the deal making and managing these alliances.
According to traditional trade theory, certain countries should be good at producing farm products, while others have an advantage in manufacturing. Every country is endowed with certain qualities that give it a special edge in producing a particular good or service, a comparative advantage over its competitors. By trading freely across national borders, people everywhere gain the benefits of each country's special circumstance. The idea of comparative advantage remains a guiding principle behind America's trade policy. But corporate strategist Michael Porter argues that comparative advantage no longer explains why certain countries win and others lose in international competition.
You are the author of an idea that comparative advantage, as a way to think about this, is passé, and that competitive advantage is a new is the new way to look at it. What's the difference?
Well, the comparative advantage notion, which is a very old theory in economics, says that a nation gains competitiveness in an industry if it has kind of a superior access to so-called factors of production, lower cost labor, abundant natural resources, a favorable climate, those kind of things. What we see as we look at international competition is that those factors, cheap labor, natural resources, are no longer the decisive factors anymore. What's decisive is innovation. The countries that win are the ones that innovate faster and in the right direction. In order to understand why innovation takes place, you need to look at a whole different set of considerations, like the demand structure, like the intensity of rivalry.
But aren't those things, those sort of population characteristics or cultural characteristics, a well-educated population, aren't they part of the old concept of comparative advantage?
I guess my point would be the well-educated population is no longer an advantage. Every nation that we're dealing with has probably a better educated population. And even Japan doesn't get particularly an advantage because of education versus Germany versus Switzerland. Increasingly, the advantage is not just having a well-educated population, it's having some process by which people are developed in some particular field. So for example, having a large pool of very, very specialized talent in software, that is an advantage. But that's nothing that's inherited by the country. Mm-hmm. In fact, that happens not because we sort of woke up and had it, but because of some very specific kinds of investments that are made in universities and firms that are tailored to particular industries. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I argue is that is not an inherited factor of production. That's something that occurs through a process that's much more sophisticated than that. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm not saying that these factors of production aren't relevant at all. What I'm saying is that they're no longer enough to explain why the Swiss win in chocolates, and the Japanese win in consumer electronics, and the Germans win in printing presses, and the Americans win in medical equipment. You can't explain that using labor cost. You can't explain that using basic skill levels. You can't explain that using national resources. You've got to resort to a more, I think, sophisticated set of factors. What we again see from many foreign countries is a paradox. Nations succeed in industries where they have tough, stringent regulations.
This is health and safety regulations.
Health and safety, environmental protection, product standards. You know, American companies complain about the German product standards. They're tough. And many American companies would argue that they're a trade barrier. Well, what they really are is they're an enormous incentive and pressure on German industry to produce very, very high quality products. Mm-hmm. So let's not abandon the American lead that we had for so many years in stringent product safety, product standards, environmental standards, and so forth. In fact, let's get back to those sorts of things.
If you are now the advisor to the CEO, or you are the CEO of a corporation that's down on the low end of the competitiveness ranking,
yep.
What do you do with that company to turn it around and make it a competitive company in the world market?
Number one, you've got to take a global approach. You've got to find the low-cost parts, the low-cost supplies, wherever they may be. Number two, you've got to seek out the world's most sophisticated customers, and you've got to make sure that you're selling to them. You realize that your workforce and your technology base is a kind of fundamental underpinning of your success, and you get on with a task of upgrading their skills. There's simply no way that an American company can compete with a Japanese company if its manufacturing workers can't operate robots.
Right.
Some of that's going to have to be done inside your own company. You're going to have to establish your own internal training. Some of it's going to be you going to your local educational institutions and working with them to establish programs that are tailored to the needs of your industry. You're going to have to find the universities and the laboratories in America where things are going on in your industry, and you're going to have to get relationships with those people. So I think those are some of the kind of steps. Now there are American companies who are taking those steps.
Let's go to the second level. What do we do to improve consumer requirements in this country? I mean, having more educated consumers, as it were.
Well, first we have to recognize that we do have those in some areas. In the medical area, for example, the United States has the most demanding customers in the world, the most sophisticated, the most advanced. Most countries have government-operated healthcare systems. They're very slow to change. They're very slow to adopt new procedures. We have this wonderful pluralistic private system. We have some of the same advantages in telecommunications, where we have many companies fighting it out now, and they're very demanding customers. We tend to have problems in areas like consumer durables, where the typical U.S. consumer buys things not to keep them for 10 years, but to use them for 3 years and toss them out.
This is refrigerators?
Refrigerators, consumer electronics. One of the problems is that, ironically, the consumption mentality in the U.S. becomes a negative, because it means that the consumer is not looking for products that last a long time. He doesn't think he's going to keep them for a lifetime. He thinks he's going to use them for a while and toss them out because he's going to buy them on credit. The German saves up his money. The Swiss saves up his money and only buys something that they want to keep for a decade. Mm-hmm. The U.S. has kind of evolved into this kind of mass consumption, disposable, throwaway mentality. That was very important in the 50s and 60s when kind of mass marketing was born. But today the world economy is moving more towards find things, keep them for a long time, have a few higher quality goods, have goods that are more customized to your needs.
How many of your students are now going into manufacturing as opposed to going into finance?
There's certainly been a major shift in student interest into two areas. One is kind of core manufacturing companies, and the second is new enterprise. I think that our students are starting to get in their minds the notion that the most exciting and interesting thing to do is actually create something. And being a trader or a broker or an intermediary has been viewed as being prestigious, and there's been high financial rewards. But I think that there's kind of a growing sense that that may not be kind of the long-term career that it's cut out to be. And that what our students are here for is to learn how to manage something.
Yeah.
And to make something happen. And so I would think that kind of shift in mentality, which I hope will accelerate, would mean that the people are moving back into manufacturing and entrepreneurship, not just because they think that's the place to get rich today, but because they view that as perhaps a better for the country, and a better contribution.
Professor Porter, thanks very much for being with us. For American Interests, I'm Morton Kondracki.
On the next edition of American Interests, a look at how American companies can solve their #1 competitive challenge, restoring quality in manufacturing. It will take flexibility on the shop floor and new approaches to managing the American workforce. Join us next week as we continue our examination of American competitiveness from the Harvard Business School, here on American Interests. American Interests is made possible by IBM and Pfizer Inc. and these leading foundations.